Program funding for the Organic Odyssey was provided by the California Certified Organic Farmers Foundation, as well as the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. Visit their web pages or social media for all their amazing content and guidance on everything organic. Support for the Organic Odyssey is provided in part by the Grimm Family Center for Organic Production and Research at Cal Poly. For more information or to support the center, please visit organic.calpoly.edu. That's organic.calpoly.edu for the Grimm Family Center for Organic Production and Research at Cal Poly. Support for the Organic Odyssey is provided in part by AgCom Central. Visit AgCom Central on twitch.tv or youtube.com for all content ag-related. That's AgCom Central on twitch.tv or youtube.com for AgCom Central.
Hello everyone, my name is Emery Pura and I'm here with my co-host Amanda Kidd. Welcome to the 5th episode of Season 2, Organic Odyssey, Journeying Through Sustainable Farming with Cal Poly. Today we will be talking about food safety with Dr. Patrick Baur and Joelle Mosso, which is a very important part of the ag industry to ensure we get safe food. We are joined by a great panel today. Dr. Baur, if you would like to introduce yourself.
So I'm Patrick Baur. I'm an assistant professor of food systems innovation and policy at the University of Rhode Island with our sustainable agriculture and food systems program. And among other things, I've been studying food safety regulation and management systems for on-farm food safety and fruit and vegetable agriculture for over 10 years. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. We're also joined by Joelle Mosso, if she would like to introduce herself.
Hi, so Joelle Mosso. I'm Associate VP of Science Programs at West Growers. We're a trade association that represents growers in the western states, predominantly California, Arizona, and New Mexico. My journey with food safety started in growing up in 8th grade, actually my first L157 presentation. And basically I'm a pathogenic ecologist and risk assessor and started my career at Earthbound Farm. The 2006 spinach outbreak is probably how a lot of people know of it. And so I've always had this balance between food safety and organic production systems since I entered the workforce, and it's my passion. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're also with Dr. Grieshop, if you'd like to tell us about what he's always on the podcast.
I'm Dr. Matt Grieshop, Director of the Grimm Family Center for Organic Production and Research here at Cal Poly.
Nice. So to start it off, can you describe some potential produce food safety risks associated with organic farming practices compared with conventional farming practices?
I'm happy to start. I think one of the things first I'd lead with is that the conversation of organic versus conventional food safety systems, that there's just food safety concerns relative to produce production in general and food production. So to vilify one or the other, to put them against each other, I think is probably not how I'd start. That being said, organic production systems, because some of the practices that are applied may introduce opportunities for different risks, whether it be including coexistence with animals or composts or some more complex compost teas and different inputs that may have issues when it comes to food safety. That being said, I think with any system, whether it be conventional or organic, is that you effectively have to look at a comprehensive approach to anything, water input, adjacent land use, and that's no different whether it's organic or conventional. And those practices for organic producers can easily be addressed or looked at from a food safety perspective to identify where risks are and how to manage them. So I guess that's where I'd land, is that no system, irrespective of organic or conventional, is absent of any risk, and a lot of that comes down to is how you manage risk.
I would build on Joelle's point there. And one thing that I think is always important to clarify is that in the United States regulatory context, and we talk about food safety, we mean that in a very specific sense. And it's really, the focus is really on microbial food safety, which is essentially protecting consumers from the risks associated with foodborne infectious diseases, pathogens in particular. And oftentimes what potentially drops out of the conversation are other kinds of risks to human health that can come along with food. And we don't in the United States tend to associate those with food safety in contexts like these. So I think that it's a very interesting thing to keep in mind. And if we think about the history of why we have the food safety system that we have for farms that are growing fruits and vegetables and for the rest of the supply chain as well, and why we have an organic certification system in place that will certify farms and products as organic, both have safety in mind. You know, the idea of safety is part of both systems. Our food safety system, again, focuses on acute risks to human health, like infectious diseases. But the organic system focuses on a different kind of safety, which is more of, if you think about the underlying values that are expressed through that system, safety in terms of long-term health. And not just long-term health of consumers, but long-term health of the people that work on farms and long-term health of our farm environments. And so I think it's interesting to think about the narrow sense of food safety and then the broader sense of safety. And other than that, I think that everything Joelle said is exactly correct. Any system has risks associated with it. To the extent that organic production is distinct in some regards from conventional production, that entails different management techniques that are necessary to control risk that are associated with practices that are unique to organic agriculture. So it's again not organic versus food safety in terms of or organic versus conventional in terms of which is riskier. It's more organic versus conventional in terms of what are the kind of different operating conditions and unique practices that differ among them, and what are the sort of food safety implications of those, and what kind of management techniques are needed to deal with that.
Kind of going along with what you just said, can you describe the main challenges in ensuring the safety of organic produce during production, processing, and distribution?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with produce production and truly any piece of agriculture is that it's an exercise of humility to realize how little we actually understand and control. So, we don't necessarily understand if we pull a lever over here and apply a certain input that we may be introducing or changing a dynamic for risk somewhere else. And so I think one of the challenges for agricultural production, particularly open air ag, so not controlled ag inside, is that we are so at the mercy of variables that we have so little control over, as well as little understanding. I mean, we're starting to understand more and more with newer technologies and science learnings, but we don't really yet understand how hazard that may be present translates to an actual risk within the food system. And just to question, I think both Patrick and I kind of smirked when you asked it. It was like, man, that is it's hard to know. It's hard to know, because I could easily create an argument that says a conventional grower, and I want to pause there too and say conventional growers are not prohibited from using organic practices. So there's nothing to say that a conventional grower may not have the exact same risk that the organic grower may have. They may just not be certified organic. So maybe they use compost or manures, etc. And they may use them in the exact same fashion as an organic grower. So just that distinction as well. But one, argument I could make about conventional agricultural systems as well is that a lot of what we talk about in organic is about balance, and it's about recognition of ecosystem. And disruption to ecosystems can also create an instability that could lead to opportunity for risk. If you use the human equivalent as like an example, if I don't eat well and I suddenly create an opportunity for a pathogen to inhabit my intestine and make me sick, it's an opportunistic pathogen. But it was there, it happened to be there, but my system's instability allowed it to proliferate. And so that's another argument. We don't have a lot of data either way. It's just, if you think about everything that we do in ecosystems, it comes down to balance and recognition of how little we probably know when we talk about any one practice in isolation.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I want to sort of circle back to what Joelle was saying at the beginning, that agriculture takes place in a complex social ecological system. Really, there are so many factors at play, including living entities, plants, as well as the various microbes that inhabit soils, both beneficial microbes and the ones that could potentially be dangerous to human health. That have their own agency and are doing their own thing, in addition to the weather, the wind, the water, the chemistry, everything else. And so, again, that idea of humility, I think, is important. And, one of the things that is said frequently, but perhaps not frequently enough in food safety, is that no matter what you do, you're never going to get zero risk. There's always going to be some risk. The industry, farmers, regulators, scientists all try to come up with ways to manage that risk, to keep it as low as possible, to keep it within, what would be an acceptable range, but it is never zero. But classically speaking, in terms of the way that people have thought about this complex system from a food safety perspective, is usually through thinking about the big categories of sources from which pathogens can get onto the edible portion of a crop. And so there's a couple things to keep in mind here. So we're talking about fruits and vegetables, and the reason that fruits and vegetables are unique is sort of twofold. So first of all, the pathogens that make humans sick, that are carried on foodborne surfaces, they're not native to plants, right? These are pathogens that can make humans, we're mammals, animals, sick. They're not necessarily native to plants. A lot of them, like some of the pathogenic E. coli and Salmonella, are basically native to animal guts. Some other pathogen microbes that can be pathogenic, like Listeria, are native to soils, but they're not necessarily native to plants. So they have to get on there somehow. And the problem with fruits and vegetables from a food safety standpoint, the reason that there is risk, is a lot of these are products that as consumers we eat raw. We want to eat them raw. They're healthy. They've got nutrition and so forth. We don't want a cooked salad. It's not the point of a salad, right? Which means that anything that was on there in the field could very well still be on there by the time we eat it. And these days we want lettuce and spinach and fruit and everything in February, even if like me, you're in Rhode Island and there's nothing growing outside. So that also introduces some opportunity for those pathogens to potentially grow and reproduce and so forth, and get some more of an infectious load by the time they get to me. So there's some risks. Now, how they get on there in the first place, that's what people really have spent a lot of time thinking about and looking at. And there's a couple main sort of categories. And Joelle, please correct me if I overlook something here in my general explanation. But if we think about the environment, right, again, as Joelle was saying, it's agriculture, right? Plants grow in soil. They get irrigated with water that can get rained on. They can get, water can flow through, and they're exposed to wind. Pathogens can potentially be carried through wind, water, windborne dust, I should say, water, and of course, on soil, right? So there are those sorts of areas that for on-farm, pre-harvest food safety management, those are areas that each farm needs to look at, and there's specific requirements about things like irrigation, water safety. The other ways that pathogens can get onto plants is from us, from people and the things that we bring into the fields, including our bodies. So, the number one thing that everybody always talks about when it comes to food safety is hand washing, right? Because the most likely place to get a human pathogen is from another human. And our hands, we touch everything, right? So, I think that's a big one, hand washing, and then also just the knowledge of hygiene and proper personal hygiene and sanitation and so forth for everybody who works in agriculture is a big one. And then, of course, all of our tools and equipment and surfaces that, tractors, knives, harvesting equipment, and then also everything, of course, that happens post-farm gate in terms of packing and processing and distributing. all of that can matter. So those are sort of like the 5 big types of areas that get focused on in food safety, in addition to some sort of meta factors, you might say, like training and education, and then record keeping and so forth, so that, if something does go wrong, we hopefully can, the operation or the farm can figure out where it went wrong and then correct it the next time.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Is it more like when there's like a pathogen that gets onto produce, or like, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but is it more likely in the field because like it's like outside in the soil and everything, or more like in a packing plant, or it doesn't really either?
I think it depends, quite frankly. So there's definitely been, well, first I'll lead with, for the produce industry, specifically like leafy greens, which is probably one of the more mature food safety industries from a produce perspective. There's so many events that happen that we have no idea how it got in, even though everyone is looking at everything that Patrick just described. So the best of intentions and programs still find opportunity. So that's one thing, but a lot of it also is just like understanding the organism. And I think that's a piece that I've thought is, just really interesting over all these years, is that, here we are, these, highly evolved multi-celled organisms, and we're chasing something that has no brain and is single cell and keeps outsmarting us. And that's why my comment about it's the first, an exercise of humility, is to recognize, like, while we are smart, they are very efficient at what they do. And once introduced in an environment, it's hard to know, was it a recent addition, or do they occasionally pass through wind or water or animals, etc. But certainly if you look at past history, especially in the last like 20 years, we talk a lot about Listeria monocytogenes with environmental contamination. So things happening in the processing plant where we potentially don't do good sanitation, we don't clean, it creates a harborage point. So effectively, is it moving through, or did you just create a house pet that's staying in your plant that gets on all your product? But that's not exclusive. There's a lot of products that have salmonella environmental concerns, and likewise Listeria being introduced in the environment as well, that could make it to the consumer. So it's hard to know. I guess the first thing I always tell people is just like, know your organism and know how they behave, because they will constantly look for an ecological niche, and sometimes follows behaviors we think we understand. But that's kind of where I start from. It's hard to say, but everything can influence everything else.
You guys touched a little bit on, well, kind of a lot on foodborne illness. How can consumers minimize their risk of foodborne illness when consuming produce?
Well, I'm not a microbiologist, and I'm not a public health professional or a medical professional. So take this with a grain of salt. But, just as we were talking about a moment ago, and Joelle was saying, it's knowing the organism and knowing that anywhere along the entire kind of chain of custody, if you will, the entire life history of something like a piece of lettuce or an apple or, whatever it might be, at any point in time, there could be a contamination event that could introduce a pathogen that could make you sick onto that produce. That could happen potentially at the farm. It could happen in the packing house. It could happen in the grocery store when, 4-year-old Susie comes along and hasn't washed her hand and touches all the apples, or it could happen in your own kitchen or in your own refrigerator, right? So you can't, again, ever get risk to zero, but I think that there's a couple things that are kind of common sense that get talked about a lot. The first is washing. Washing is not a kill step. It's not a perfect guarantee, but it's not going to hurt. And it can definitely help to, hopefully remove at least some of anything that might be on the surfaces. Again, it's not perfect. So that's one thing. I think another thing is, if there's a particular, it's also knowing yourself, right? As Joelle was saying, knowing the organism, but also knowing yourself. And people are not all the same. Some people are at higher risk due to underlying conditions, due to age, due to any sort of health complications that they might be experiencing. And I think that folks in that position might want to be thinking about food safety and their food safety precautions. And I think most people in those positions do, differently than somebody who is, not suffering from sort of any underlying health conditions, right? So there's that aspect as well. But certainly cooking, right? Not every fruit and vegetable do we want to eat cooked, but a lot we can. And so if there is a high vulnerability, one thing that's often recommended is simply cooking, because that is a kill step if it's done at the right temperature for the right amount of time. So, but those are two important things. Joelle, you maybe have other thoughts. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the first piece is, and I've heard you guys talk about it on prior podcasts, is just thinking about, as a culture and society, is connecting to your food and recognizing what it is and how it's produced. And I think over the years, we've all kind of become somewhat blissfully ignorant about the risks that could come from food. Like, as Patrick has said a couple times now, right, there's no zero risk. But if you look at, how we handle food, the expectation, it's probably not a good idea to leave your food sitting in your car half the day and then come back and eat it. There's just certain things that we as consumers can do to be educated, understand our food systems, and understand how we contribute to potential food safety risks. We talk a lot about bacterial pathogens, and certainly we do that in respect to outbreaks and recalls, but the number one foodborne illness in the United States is norovirus, and that comes from humans directly. It's not coming from animals, it's coming from humans. So if we think about that, we're a big contributor to our own food safety problems.
Yeah, and for norovirus in particular, again, that's one of the pathogens that is not getting on in the farm environment. That's much later. So like the biggest risk, like there are still huge risks of contamination, not huge risks, but there are significant risks of contamination much later on, including again, the kitchen, refrigerator, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a reason, more ancient societies and even some current ones cook everything. It's like natural selection. We figured out, oh, well, if I cook it, it's not going to make me sick. Therefore, I will cook everything. And so we also now recognize, though, the value of the nutritional content of vegetables and fruits that are not cooked. So things that maybe break down, when we actually expose them to heat. So it's always that balance. But I also would like to emphasize is that, we talk a lot about risks and we forget that the majority of eating events are very, very safe. So it's like we're talking about, if we're looking at a distribution, we're talking about that little smidge at the end of the people who are going to have an adverse event. But in general, we have a very safe food system. Doesn't mean we can't do better, but we do have a good food system.
Yeah, and I mean, you can think about there's 300 million people, over 300 million people in this country, who, hopefully are eating somewhere in the vicinity of 3 meals a day. Not quite everybody, of course, but there are hundreds of millions of meals every day that happen every day of the year. And so I think that helps put things in perspective too.
Yeah, that's actually something I've thought about a lot, and even back around 2006, 2009, when a lot of, we had those early outbreaks on spinach and other leafy greens, was, we have close to 1/3 of a billion people in the country, and if they eat 3 pieces of produce a day, that's 1 billion potential exposure events. And so, getting past that perception of a hazard and then thinking about the risk, I think, it's really important. But it also doesn't take away from the fact that, if somebody gets seriously ill or dies from a foodborne, pathogen or illness, it's a tragedy and it's horrible, and we want to try to prevent that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we show up every day. Right?
Yeah.
So food safety people who manage food safety is we manage for sometimes one person that we'll never meet. And, that's what makes us show up every day. That's what brought me into the field was, you're going to be a public health advocate in the private industry. But, there's been times for myself where I've had to remind myself, like, the world is not on fire. I am trying to remember and how to, to make present the risk so that we can address it such that that one person doesn't get sick. But we also need to keep context in that, like, everything is on fire.
So-
Even though that's what we talk about a lot.
So I've
Yeah.
got a,
And I
oh,
will,
go ahead.
oh, could I add one thing? Sorry.
Please.
Just as a person that I don't work in the industry, I'm not a farmer and I don't work in the industry, I'm an academic. But I've spoken with so many people throughout the industry over the years at all stages. And the one thing that I've really noticed that is interesting and I think worthwhile saying is people aren't generally in that industry waking up in the day thinking, how can I cut corners, right? How can I endanger people and make another buck? I mean, these are people who are working to get fruits and vegetables, which is, what we think of as healthy food to consumers. And I think most of them, the vast majority of everybody I've certainly talked to, is sort of horrified by the thought that anything they might do might, instead of helping somebody get healthy food, might make somebody sick. And so I don't think there's a lack of motivation and incentive that I've ever seen, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in the industry my whole career, and I can attest to that, is that growers who produce food for people do so very intentionally with their whole heart. And I have worked with many people who have been associated with, adverse events, and they take it so personally. Because they bring themselves every day and fight everything that they're trying to do to bring food to people's tables. And I have never seen anyone do something that they just knowingly knew they were going to hurt someone. That's just, everyone's showing up every day trying to do their best. It's just a challenging problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I really like the way you started, Joelle, with that sort of humility, standpoint of humility and understanding that, hey, there's a lot of things you don't know. But with that in mind, for both of you all, what do you think, what are some exciting frontiers? Do you see some exciting frontiers in terms of food safety and understanding how we fit these practices, these myriad practices together that go into whatever style of produce growing you're doing? And, one thing I think I heard you say was, the concept of ecological disruption. And that's, really clear. I mean, in crop production even, it's like you disrupt an ecosystem and then suddenly you have all these pest problems, and which some of them could be microbes, maybe not human microbes, but plant microbes. Are there exciting things you see kind of coming to fore, or exciting things you would like to see come to fore in terms of research and questions to answer in this sort of nexus of food safety and production?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton. That's why I'm in this industry. I think one, so I'll start with kind of where I left, is that, it's over time, what's easy to measure isn't always the thing that matters. And so we've, are increasing in our ability to learn more, assess more, see more in our testing technologies, whether it be for pathogens or understanding the microbiome of an environment, or broader metadata with AI to be able to actually associate things that may be correlated that we never would have predicted. So I think there's an enormous amount of learnings to come, and to really recognize that we're at this like infancy where, what brought me into food safety was my first presentation, right, in 8th grade. And that was the cover of Time magazine was E. coli 0157. That's how pivotal molecular biology was at that point, where that made the cover of Time magazine, the identification of a foodborne pathogen using PCR. That's really we're just starting to understand, better methods, better ways to look at things more comprehensively. So soil shifts and the microbiomes of those. I think we just have so much that we don't know. And we have, maybe made assumptions that we understand, but we don't. And I think so that's the exciting piece, is that we just keep learning more, and we're starting to look at things more broadly than just one variable at a time. And that's where I think is the most exciting, is that we aren't going to look at just one thing, like, oh, salmonella on this product. Like, no, salmonella in relation to everything else that's going on, biodiversity, land management, all this out in water usage, everything, because it's all interrelated.
I really like where Joelle took that there, and to me, that's very much, I think, relates to what I see as the exciting potential turn that the food safety sort of frontier could push. And earlier, Joelle said something I think is really important about organic agriculture in particular, which is this idea that organic agriculture takes ecosystems seriously, right? Takes seriously the idea that agriculture takes place within ecosystems, and to do good organic agriculture means working with ecosystems, these complex systems that we don't have full control over, with a certain degree of humility. What I think is really exciting, and this is kind of like a big picture sort of thing, but is the potential to approach food safety through the lens of ecological management, right? Joel earlier was saying, know the organism. Well, knowing an organism is also knowing an organism's interactions with and life history with and evolutionary history with its environments, right? And I think there's a lot of really promising potential, in the sort of intersection of fields of microbiology and food science and ecological sciences and evolutionary sciences to understand the ways that we might deal with food safety, not just through sort of a command and control sort of perspective, but through a vulnerability and resilience and adaptation perspective, right? Again, with the understanding that no matter what we do, we can't control absolutely everything. The system is too open and too complex, and there are too many pieces that, as humans, we just don't have control over. We cannot control the evolution of these microbes. We cannot really, So I think it's really interesting to think about it from that perspective. For example, right? How does a soil microbiome influence the survival and fate and transport of known pathogens, right? Can we build up soil health as an ecosystem service that service is pathogen suppression, for example, right? That's still a very nascent field, but I think there's a lot of promise there. And for me, as somebody who studies and focuses more on the sort of human and social dimensions of all of this, what I see is really exciting, that I hope is something that we're going to see more of, is the way that safety, right, is something that we all have a stake in, everybody cares about, because we all eat. The way that, as the food safety conversation takes a little bit more systemic kind of perspective, a little bit more ecological perspective that starts to say, hey, we need to pay attention to all these other moving parts, that also opens a door for a broader public conversation about our food as a food system and all the different pieces that go into that, which, as Joelle was referring to earlier, we've, as a society, had the luxury for a long time in some ways of not paying a whole lot of attention to where the food comes from, not having to care about all the systems that make it possible, and any problems that might be going on with those systems. And so I'm hopeful, I would say, and I'm excited for the potential for an expanded food safety conversation to be an entry point for the public to have a better understanding of our food system and all the complexities that go into that. And also hopefully just to then care a little bit more about the overall health and status of that whole system.
Awesome. To end the podcast, can you describe some measures to increase food safety to prevent further outbreaks in the future?
I mean, I think that the field of like good agricultural practices and good manufacturing practices have a lot of common sense. So a lot of just, okay, how can we clean this better? How can we verify that it's clean? How can we do so routinely? How can we be more proactive in identifying what opportunity for introduction of risks are? I think those are always those are in place and are continually always evolving based on what we understand. I think having spent a good bit of my career actually in the testing industry space, I think I'd also challenge people to challenge their systems more. So I think one of the things that I recognize speaking to so many different companies about their food safety plans and their procedures is that we get onto what I often call like a treadmill where we're running and we don't know how to change the speed and we don't know how to get off. And we stop trying to evaluate whether or not we're effective. And really good food safety programs actually would have the expectation that over time, we'd be able to show continuous improvement and further reduce residual risk. And I don't think a lot of our systems are actually built that way. They're built with really good intentions to monitor or try to verify, but we're not necessarily learning a lot from what we do in our behaviors. And so one of the things that excites me on the last question, about where things are going, is really starting to look at what are we doing for food safety and what is the impact? How does that actually reduce risk? And I think we're just starting to get to those kind of places where we're starting to look at, okay, well, what are we doing with these practices? I know I've said on a different interview before is that, it's never a bad practice to wear a hairnet in the field. But do I think that hairnet in the field is going to stop a food safety outbreak? No, I don't. So not all practices are equal. How do we identify which ones have the most, demonstrable impact to reducing risk to a consumer? So that's, if I had to suggest to people, is like, look at what you're doing and recognize you can change it. If you're not learning anything anymore or you're seeing stagnant results, it's kind of like when you're trying to lose weight. If you've stopped losing weight, you need to try something different. And try a different exercise, go do something, eat something different. And it's the same concept in food safety management. Don't just set it and forget it. Risks change, so do the organisms. I think that was also one of the things I learned when I started running a lab at one point was all my food safety pathogenic microeducation. And one of the first organisms we culture confirmed in the lab was Listeria monocytogenes off of a dried black bean. And I'm like, okay, I never would have said that was going to be a high risk product, low water activity, all the things that my textbook did not say. And I just beautifully culture confirmed it. So no one told Listeria didn't like low water activity. So it's just, that's what I think is that I don't think there's any new practice overnight that we're going to identify that we haven't thought of before. It's just probably improving how we apply them and what we do with the activities that we're doing.
Yeah, super interesting to learn about all this new information. With that being said, we just want to say thank you so much to Patrick and Joelle for joining us today, and we hope everyone enjoyed this episode. Have a great day.
Program funding for the Organic Odyssey was provided by the California Certified Organic Farmers Foundation, as well as the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. The show was created by Matt Grieshop, the talent coordinator and resident organic expert, as well as Moses Mike, the faculty production lead. The guests for today's episode were Patrick Baur and Joelle Mosso. The Organic Odyssey is a production of the AGC 225 class called Digital Communications in Agriculture. The student team that produced the show included Andrew Angulo, the director, hosts Amanda Kidd and Emery Pura, and the technical team, Bailey Knirk, Daniela Rodriguez-Ruiz, Delaney Browder, Katie Cook, and Sierra Fugman. The Organic Odyssey is a digital media collaboration between the Agricultural Education and Communications Department and the Grimm Family Center for Organic Production and Research at Cal Poly. These credits were read by Chelsea Ann. Thanks for listening.